Hello, I'm James Simister, and this is St. Peter's Church, Preston in Brighton. One of the outstanding features of this church is the 3 medieval wall paintings which were completed in the 1200s. And one of them in particular is the painting, one of the first depictions of the killing of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. It's St. Thomas Becket. Here is the figure in white in the centre. You can see his chaplain on the right, and on the left you can see the 4 knights who are attacking him with swords. Thomas Becket was a Londoner from a wealthy merchant family. He wasn't from the gentry or the nobility. And he studied law as a young man. Now in those days, even if you wanted a career in the church, law was more important than theology. Thomas became a clerk in the household of Archbishop Theobald, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury. And it was there that he met the young king. So you had 2 energetic, charismatic, talented, lively young men, and they became close personal friends. And there's a story about them riding side by side one day through London, and they saw a beggar by the roadside, and Henry II said to Becket, "Look at that poor man in the cold, you should give him your cloak." And Becket said to Henry, "But I only have one cloak, you have many cloaks." And Henry II leaned over from his horse onto Thomas Becket's and physically removed the cloak from Becket's back as they rode along and gave it to the beggar. Well, that story may be proverbial, but it shows how close and familiar the relationship was between these 2 energetic, talented young men. When Archbishop Theobald died, Henry decided that he would appoint Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury at the age of only 43. Thomas was already Lord Chancellor of England, but once he was appointed as Archbishop, he resigned as Lord Chancellor. He decided that he wasn't going to be a courtier Archbishop, that he was going to devote his energies to the church. And Henry was very disappointed because he had hoped to tie the Archbishop of Canterbury closely into the royal government and to benefit from a very close relationship between church and state. But that didn't happen. Archbishop Thomas Becket increasingly became a man who spoke up for the church. And after only 2 years as Archbishop, matters came to a head when Henry introduced various legal reforms. Now, Henry II is a very, very important figure for the development of common law in England, and he's often referred to as the father of the common law. He also introduced various other legal reforms, but the one that caused problems with Becket was that he tried to get rid of the special jurisdiction of the church. In the Middle Ages, the word clerk, clergyman, cleric, essentially it means the same thing, because the only people who had learning were the clergy. And if you entered holy orders, even at the lowest level, there were several different levels, but if you became a clerk, even at the lowest level, then you came within the jurisdiction of church courts. And this meant that if you committed even a very serious offence like murder, you would be tried in a church court. But a church court could not hand down a punishment of blood or death. So if you were convicted in a church court, even of a very serious offence, you would get away with a relatively light penalty compared with the deaths, hangings, mutilations which were decreed by the state courts. the king was outraged by various cases where people in holy orders, perhaps at the lower levels of acolytes and deacons, had committed serious offences and then got off lightly. So he was determined to end this so-called benefit of clergy and bring in a standardised justice system which should be run by his sheriffs in the counties around England. Thomas Becket resisted this furiously. Thomas stormed out of one royal council and eventually fled into exile, and he remained in exile for almost 6 years, from 1164 until 1170. Now, there's long negotiations and correspondence and appeals to the Pope which go on throughout this period of 6 years. But for our purposes, the key thing is that in 1170 there was supposedly a reconciliation between Henry II and Becket. Becket had been in France for most of the period that he'd been in exile over those 6 years, and Henry had been regularly sending messengers, correspondence to and fro. Eventually, a compromise was arrived at whereby some of the church reforms would go through. And so Becket returned to England in 1170. As soon as he came back, far from being conciliatory, he actually started to cause dissension and controversy all over again. And Henry II, who was on the other side of the Channel in Normandy, heard of this and then uttered the famous remark, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights interpreted this as an order to get rid of Becket by any means necessary. Becket had caused so much trouble for the king over the previous 6 years, and I think both Henry II and some of his courtiers were at their wits' end as to what to do. And this was a way of cutting the Gordian knot and solving the problem in the most brutal way. What actually happened on the 29th of December 1170 was deeply shocking to everyone in medieval Europe. The idea that an archbishop could be killed in his own cathedral so brutally, so bloodily, by a group of knights was was outrageous and shocking to almost everyone in medieval Europe at that time. Well, in the end, Henry II didn't get all the reforms that he wanted to. It wasn't until the Reformation and King Henry VIII that the English church became fully subservient to the English state. St. Thomas rapidly became one of the most popular saints in medieval Europe. He was seen, rightly or wrongly, as having resisted royal oppression, autocracy, and as having stood up for the church and its people against a very powerful king. Thank you very much.